Well, hey everybody, welcome. I wanted to introduce you to two of my friends and local pastors in the Pasadena area. This is Bobby Harrison and Ines Velasquez McBride. They are co-pastors for the church that we hope for, that is currently in Pasadena, California. So welcome, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming to my home. That's kind of fun.
It feels real. We're at a real table
Yeah,
in a real home.
Yeah.
In person.
Real
It's
beverages.
not just like, well, we are embodied beings, right?
That's
So I'm
right.
trying to hold that.
Yeah.
So I just have a bunch of questions for you guys and would love to hear how you think about some of the concepts that we've been learning in this class. I know the students have been wanting to hear a little bit from pastors and how they think through these issues. So first, just tell us a little bit about you both. How would you talk about your calling that led you to co-pastor this church?
Embodied beings. Ladies first.
So I'm turning my body.
That's right.
Great
There's
intentionality.
something happening here right now
There's a
that
posture shift.
we are intentional when we enter into certain rooms.
Yeah.
Can you just, I just want to pause. What just happened
Explain
there?
that.
What happened?
Explain that. Explain what just happened.
Oh, there is a decentering that happens for us. I would say naturally, but it's something we've worked on over time and been great intentional about. We step into spaces, and especially in our U.S. cultural context, it's almost implied that I'm going to speak first, or that a question is going to be addressed to me first, as some sort of expertise because of white maleness. And so for us, we just always aim to decenter that as best as we can. And so we've certainly been in spaces where Ines has almost been made to feel invisible in the room. And so we're just going to try to push a paradigm in a different direction. So very naturally, and she doesn't always love it because sometimes she would rather go second.
Sure.
But yeah, just shift the body and just look
really
at her.
appreciate
We
that.
can elaborate more on that a little bit later too.
Yeah.
I noticed that I introduced you first, and that was not intentional. But as I was doing it, I thought, why did I just implicit? I just did this.
Yeah.
It's implicit.
So it's just kind of there. So I appreciate the intentionality.
Yeah.
And when Bobby was saying he's turning his body to look towards me, he's also noticed that when we're in a room among men, especially if I'm the only female, that men will not look at me when I'm speaking. So even when I'm speaking, they will defer to him and look at him. And so he will turn his body so that he doesn't have eye contact with the audience, and that they see that he is paying attention.
Nice.
And so every little move we have noticed, and every move is theological.
Yeah.
It really is.
I love that. I love that.
So hello.
Hi.
Oh,
Is it still going? I hope so. Yeah.
It is.
Wait, good.
It's just the screen.
I guess the screen will go off. Okay,
I guess
we'll
we'll just keep going.
There's no teleprompter.
There is no teleprompter. Okay, well, my name is Ines Velasquez McBride, and I'm a Nicaraguan. That's important to me for my embodied leadership. I am an immigrant in the U.S. I've been a pastor for 20 years, and I'm a third-generation pastor. My grandfather was a pastor, and my father is a pastor, and I'm the first female, so that's very important to embodiment as well. And yes, we are co-lead pastors of the church we hope for, and this embodied leadership is very intentional because of how opposite we are to each other, how opposite our bodies are as an immigrant, as a Nicaraguan, as a female. To be equal at the pulpit and be equal in leadership is something that takes great intentionality. So this is our embodied reconciliation in co-leadership. And my calling, you asked about how would I describe my calling that led me to co-pastor with Bobby. I would say that my calling has been communal, that others have called the gift of the pastoral leadership out of me because I didn't believe that women at one point women could be pastors, and so my calling was communal because a community of faith called that out of me. My calling is contextual because I lead from my social location, from my Nicaraguan soil, from the faith of my ancestors. What I bring to the table at our church as a co-leader, I bring fully from my social location and from my faith context, and I try to lead from that place at all times. And so I decenter white maleness by being my full authentic self. And how I preach and how I lead and how I pastor and how I counsel and how I use my voice and how I negotiate my body. And then I would say that our calling has been costly. And so it has been costly to plant a church in the middle of the pandemic, but it has been costly to fight for this equity and this equality. So I don't know if you want to jump in with your story and who you are as well, and you can weave our stories together of how we came to lead.
I grew up in Arkansas in the Bible Belt south of these United States, and I moved around the country a little bit until I was 7, and then landed in Arkansas where my family was from. But I think because I moved from an earlier age, I just always felt like I was from somewhere else than where I even grew up. I didn't grow up with a Southern accent, and so my voice felt more of like placeless in a different kind of way. Even Southern culture, while I love barbecue,
Thank you.
while I grew to appreciate and love SEC sports, there were other parts of it that I just felt like dissonant towards, and so I always felt like I'm here, but I'm not from here, and so placeless to a certain degree, which is hard as a young boy, trying to find identity and connectivity and solidarity. Went away to college in Chicago, came back home to Arkansas. Always had this like California dream in my mind, I think, since a little boy. And then I'm married, have 3 kids, and it was time to consider seminary as a young pastor. And I came out to California in January, and it was blue skies and white clouds.
And he said, "Yes, Lord."
The Lord
Yes, Lord.
had determined for me.
I can hear the costliness.
It was
So
it came with a
costly.
cost.
I had the same story.
Thank you for understanding. No one
Totally.
understands. But I walked into a Fuller classroom, and I looked around, and I just remember thinking, where else will I get to experience the intermingling of bodies, of such difference, but also such willingness to pursue the unity of this work. It's hard work. Seminary is hard work. And so to go to a place where difference would be celebrated and highlighted, especially coming from a particularly black-white binary of the U.S. South, for me as a white man that was beginning to deconstruct race and ethnicity, reconciliation, racial justice, what this looked like. We've been a predominantly white church for 20 plus years, but it began to take steps of great intentionality towards breaking that paradigm and moving towards one that more represented the kingdom. And Fuller just seemed to express that and gave a heart for that. I took classes on sexuality and ethics. I took classes on race and ethnic identity, one of those from a black woman, the other from a white woman. Began to recognize this implicit thing I would have in selecting courses where it very naturally would select white males. And just didn't realize I was doing it until like this light bulb went off and go, man, the most easy switch will be to go towards this white male professor. And there's something that's still good. Some of my best professors were white male. But I realized I had to be intentional to choose professors that looked different than I am and had different experiences than I am. And that was some of the best life-giving movements that I took, was just who I took classes to learn under. I think during that whole story of seminary, this possibility of a church plant that could look like this was kind of like brewing underneath the surface, whether I knew it or not. And Ines and I, when we talk about our differences, we're 2 of the most polarized bodies in the U.S. As a white man from the South, as a Latina, Nicaraguan, immigrant woman, there are borders, not just in physicality, but in ideology that separate folks like us from each other.
Married, but not to one another.
That is true. We are married.
I have to say I'm married, but
not to one another.
People make that assumption
we
as
highlight
well
that.
as co-pastors.
And so this idea of a church plant that could bring the 2 of us together, not just in ideas, or not just, hey, sometimes I'll come preach at your church, sometimes you come preach at my church, but what would it look like to really lead a church together? And we're often asked even about that. How come I'm not the lead pastor and she's the associate? Or how come she's not the lead pastor and I'm the associate?
Yeah, sure.
And there's stories underneath both of those narratives. But I think the 2 of us desired something that felt like an expression of kingdom come now on earth as it is in heaven. And what we envision in heaven is the 2 of us side by side and face to face in intimacy and oneness and connectedness. We're serving, we're leading, we're living, we're doing life together. And so a church like that just felt like we couldn't find it anywhere else. Felt like we would have to go to a church to try to like steer it. And that has not worked well in the past. And so it really felt like something we had to start to bring a lot of our life experience together to share for the sake of this church.
The Trinity is very embodied. Not even God leads
Right.
alone.
So even when
or
you say
solo.
that language, it doesn't ring true right away for me.
Right.
Because
right.
of how we've been shaped. The Trinity is
Yeah.
like an idea. It's a
It's
theology.
like I can
Three.
see the three next to each
ethereal,
other.
it's
Right.
Clover.
But
Right.
relational?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Trinity
They're
is relational?
Yeah.
They have spiritual intimacy. They don't
Mhm.
make decisions alone. Like
Yeah.
there's not one solo leader.
Mhm.
And so because of that, I believe that hierarchy of a solo, single superstar leader is misogynistic in nature, and it's outside of the Trinity. And so Bobby and I have tried to have shared leadership. So when he was talking about shared power, our co-leadership is intentional, and it's grounded in Genesis 1 and 2, grounded in a Trinity that is communal, in a Trinity that embodies oneness, in a Trinity that is equal as well. And hierarchy, I believe, even when you have a female leader at the top, the temptation to take absolute power and to abuse it is there, whether male or female. So I believe that hierarchies are misogynistic in nature. And this work is slower and it is harder, but it has been better for oneness. And it has taught me a lot about myself, about my blind spots, our blind spots as male, female, gender differences, ethnic differences as well.
Right.
So we are historical beings. And so historically, it has been the white male, right, that leads institutions and churches and communities and nonprofits. And so this is undoing a lot. And that shared power, we try to tap into that power. And that's, I think Bobby says this all the time, that the power that we have, we are aware that he has been given more power societally. But we're trying to share that power in how we lead all the time.
I can hear the costliness that you're talking about, the costliness. And you both have said many times, even in the intro, how intentional you've had to be. Intentional in turning your body, intentional in thinking about the borders, intentional about having the conversations about bodies and all of this. It's a lot slower work. And we know what works, if you will, that shoots a pastor up to the top is single, has a lot of power, has some power people under them, and he or she just moves to the top. And so I guess I'm just really appreciating the beauty and the difficulty that you both have chosen into.
Yeah.
The visualization, when you use that language, even I picture like a climbing over bodies to get to the top of that ladder, you know. And so for us to not build that, to not succumb to that, to not be enticed by that, and that's just kept track of the amount of fundraising support that we have been denied. And she can share the number, but it is
670,000.
Whoa! I need to pause there.
Yes,
because of this intentional decision, you've been denied $670,000 from people who would have otherwise supported your church.
From church planting, foundation money, church planting, seed money, grants, anything available that is super quick to be available to men, especially white males. But when I enter the room, I've already made a theological statement. Without us saying a word, when we both enter the room, it would be way easier just to send Bobby, right? But when we enter the room, we're destabilizing historical epistemologies with that. We're destabilizing the system, and people have questions, right? And when you push back against the system, that gives him an advantage, and not me. For all the intersections that I embody, gender, female, ethnic, the fact that I'm not married to him, suspicion about that, questions that get asked that are inappropriate, that would not be asked of a male. And so because we have pushed back and said that's not an okay question to ask, then you don't get that funding, you don't get that grant, because you're pushing back against a system that's comfortable. Because racism and sexism are self-protective and self-perpetuating, and they're not self-correcting. And so our bodies, at a cost to us, our bodies are correcting that system, but at a cost to us.
And it's not only ideologically that people may disagree, but it hits the pocketbooks.
That's right. There's an economic.
This is not a smart plan.
Like, if you want to plant a church and be stable and
this is not a
comfortable,
fiscally responsible
don't do this.
model.
But don't share power.
We all know, though, it's so much the gospel, right? Jesus turns it on its
And I think one of the other narratives underneath the surface of even everything you just shared is it has never been explicitly stated you're not getting this funding because ...
Right.
And so it's
No one would say that to your
all
It's implicit bias.
the
Right.
microaggressions underneath the surface that then affect your body. Because you're walking in with like a history of stress in spaces like this,
Yes.
then you're walking into the room already with the sense of your guard is up, your body is up,
Right.
and you're trying to navigate through that just to be like our normal operating system, just the two of us, is not a place of fear. We're very comfortable with each other. We're comfortable in our bodies with one another. We're comfortable in a room with one another. But when you're met with somebody else's fear or questions or concerns or doubts, or maybe their own history,
anxiety.
their story, we don't know what they've navigated through. And so it can be projected upon you that you're then supposed to wear. And we've just had to say to each other, like, I don't want to wear that. Like, take it back.
Yes.
We've had drives back, in drives together in a car, just the two of us together. So we can say that as well,
Right.
because we're comfortable in our bodies. Our spouses are comfortable with our bodies in relationship with one another. Drives back where we just have to almost feel like we're trying to cleanse the other one. Like all that was said, all that was projected against you, all that was held against us, we're throwing that out the window before we get home so that when we walk back into our houses, we're back in ourselves again. But yeah, somebody else's own mess can make you feel icky.
Sure. And needing to differentiate yourself from that mess.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hopefully they'll learn, but at some point you just have to kind of step back and say, I can't heal you. I can't make you see this as the truth that we're living into.
Yeah.
And so you just kind of have to protect each other and care for each other.
Yes.
Right. Okay. I have a slight anxiety that I just want to make sure that this is still going. It's hard to see. Okay, there we go. So thank you so much. It's been so great as we're kind of jumping into these things. What would you guys say? So a number of our students are working in nonprofits, they're working in ministries, they're at churches. What are the values that you both think you embody, that you bring to the church, that have been intentional for you? And we've already been talking about them, but I'm just wondering, are there any others that you would tease out that you would say, this is truly important for us to embody these particular values?
We didn't write out a vision statement for the church before we launched the church. Even that word launch, it feels like corporate starter lingo that is all monetary and all that stuff.
Sure.
When we buried the church in soil and hoped that God would grow it. I think that's been truer for our reality. Sure. We didn't have vision. We tried. We got cute with pens and paper in coffee shops.
Really?
And we really thought,
we're gonna write something
today's
down.
the day.
Yes.
We're going to
The
sit
Lord.
here,
Stone
Over the
legal
tablets
pad,
descend from heaven.
and we would just leave kind of frustrated. We'd write a ton of stuff.
Well, what happened?
None of it felt true. And so I think what we realized is we needed to be around a people, and in relationship with people, have that speak back to us, with us, and then take notes along the way. And so what we knew is we had a heart for people. We had people that we were already in relationship with. And as we gathered together, something was going to form different than just the two of us having ideas at a coffee shop.
Right.
And so as we were in tune to that, then words began to come over 6 months of being together that we could put on paper and present back to people, and they could reflect it back and go, oh yeah, that's us.
Yeah.
You captured us. It felt like photographers capturing a portrait.
Yeah.
Like this is who we already are. More than trying to do a portrait beforehand, and this is what you're going to look like.
It's so much more organic.
It was more organic, it was more
Even
real,
the
it was
soil
more
you're
true.
talking about. Yeah.
And so vision language that emerged for us is that the church we hope for is a beloved community, which is a nod to Dr. King and a dream that for us is becoming a reality. We are a beloved community, moved by the Spirit. And even that language was language that someone had to kind of put back in for us because we had not named the Spirit in our vision language. And somebody said, when we're around y'all, there's just a sense or a flow or a comfort and a wildness of the Spirit that is present. You got to find a way to incorporate that. And we're like, you know what? We're going to listen to our community. So we're a beloved community, moved by the Spirit. Yep, that feels true. What's this last part? To follow the life, love, and justice of Jesus. That was language that emerged for us. What does it look like to follow the life, love, and justice of Jesus? And so this is our vision, but it also inherently is speaking to values as well. When you look at creeds and creedal statements written over those early days of Christianity, So quickly we moved from Jesus was born,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus died, and then Jesus was resurrected. And for me, there's just a gap. What do you mean he was born and then he died? What kind of story is that? Like, isn't there something in between? And those had to be written at a certain time for a certain purpose to communicate certain truths. I get that. But for us, we were so integrally interested in the life. Like, what happened in that life that involved Jesus and bodies and people and community and touch and tears and all of those things all together, hair, all of those things that we just associate. And so we spent our first chunk of time in the book of John together looking at the life, love, and justice of Jesus that was connected to bodies. And so really rooting ourselves in that and giving ourselves a sense for our people, we really care about this part of Jesus' story. Yes, the birth, yes. Like, let's talk about that. Let's really wrestle in that. His death and resurrection. Right now we're in a sermon series on resurrections. And even that is more of an embodied conversation than it is this ethereal, Jesus resurrected and came back as a hologram, which is like what is in our minds so quickly.
I mean, historically, we know that it's true that bodies aren't as integrated into how we think about church. But as you think about that, what is my question here? Like, why are we so afraid of it? Why are churches, and you aren't, but why are churches so afraid to talk about bodies?
I think we have been historically told that our bodies are bad. And when you go to Genesis 3, we have whole creeds and doctrinal statements, right, that of original sin. And so our bodies are bad. And then you look at our sacred book, which was informed by Greco-Roman thought, and body and spirit were separated, right? And I think our writers, the writers of that text, were informed by that as well. And so I think implicitly at times they write from a place of trauma. They write from a place of body and flesh. Flesh is terrible, you know? But in the midst of the sermon series that we have been in, not just Resurrections, but Lent, and a sermon that Bobby preached last year on the flesh, I started thinking, goodness, we need to write down theories about sin. Yes, that is part of our story. With also doctrines about original goodness. So in the same way that we look towards Genesis 1 and 2 as good soil for our embodied leadership, we also looked there to get good theology about our bodies. God made us, the three of us, and said, you are tov, which is you are much good. Before there was a fall, whatever we want to call it, before we were stained by sin, before we knew that we could now have access to temptation, right? Of course we can do evil things with our body. I can choose to hit you right now.
Please don't.
Right. Please don't. I won't. And that's my agency that God has given me to do right or wrong. But if we take a step back and look at our bodies, the goodness of our bodies, in Genesis 1 and 2, we need a good theology of body. But our bodies are good. And so now, I believe in original goodness and how to return to that from a place of Jesus has come to redeem that as well. But aware that we, of course, absolutely have every day, I'm one thought away from going and veering in the wrong direction. Every day, I'm one thought away. I'm aware of that. But also God says that I am tov, that I am much good. And so we're even trying to teach our children, and Bobby's wife, Amy, is over our young people's church, and she was teaching them. She put a little sticker on all of the kids because we were in a Genesis sermon series, and she put a sticker on the kids teaching them that they're good. Oh, I think she wrote down very good, right? And so
There's
I was wondering why all the kids were running around and they had no names. They had a name tag that said very good.
Very good.
To teach our children, can you imagine how to like rewire our brain?
And it wasn't related to their behavior.
It had
wasn't
nothing
like,
to do with
you've
their
been very
behavior.
good today,
Right,
and you have not. Which we might need those name
I'm
tags
just
too.
going to cut the very off of that part for you.
Kind of good.
Yes.
Yeah, no,
and
it's
so
just
we've
about
been afraid of bodies, afraid of.
So you guys we've started to talk about trauma, and as you were thinking through how the prophets post-exilic period have experienced trauma in their bodies, let's bring the idea of trauma into the church. When you work with people who you can tell have trauma, like what thoughts come up, what questions come up? Do you have particular ways that you think through how to deal with someone, how to refer someone? What is trauma? And we talk about the big T trauma and the small T trauma. How did those come up in your pastoral work?
Yeah, I would say that we are a trauma-informed church. We try to be a trauma-informed church, but also we are a trauma-shaped church. Both our stories is personal, but then also communal in our calling together. I would say that our faith community is in spiritual recovery from church hurt. And I use that language because it does feel like sometimes we're going through the stages of grief and the stages of a 12-step program at times. But we are attentive to it. And so not only when we counsel one-on-one do different traumas come up from our personal stories, but I remember at the beginning of us planting this church, Bobby said, now we're going to draw people that have been wounded by the church, like we have been wounded by the capital C church. And I said, oh, sure, yeah, we'll do that. But I had no idea. I had no idea how prevalent that would be, how critical that would be.
How painful.
How painful that would be.
How did you know that was going to be true?
How did you know that?
I don't want to interrupt from you, but
not in a
how did you
prophetic,
both know?
really not in a
had
prophetic
these
way. Just knew that if we were true to ourselves,
Yeah.
and if people were going to be connected to what God was doing in us, again, not to make the church in our image or to make it about us, but if people were going to be drawn to the leadership that we were going to be bringing to the table, then it's leadership that's very in tune with our own brokenness and our own stories of hurt, our own stories of trauma. And both of us are very in tune with pain and loss. And we're open with sharing that. Not just holding on to it as my private part of my life, my story. There are parts of it that are still precious, but there's a lot of it that's just open and vulnerable. And so I knew if we were going to lead from that posture, then that was going to draw people who needed that and who are not just like, oh, no, thank you. I remember years ago I was leading a men's small group, and we had a really good group of guys, really intimate, and guys were being really vulnerable with each other. And a guy invited a friend who came once and didn't come back. And my friend said, why didn't you come back? He said, that's exactly what I needed, but I know I'm not ready for it. And so what he saw was
insightful.
Intimacy, the vulnerability, the courage, the pain, the rawness of it all. He said, I know I need that. I'm not ready for it. And so there are people that are going to check out from our church by checking it out the first time and not coming back because that looks good.
Yeah.
It's not what I'm ready for.
Yeah. So because our faith community has probably every person is in spiritual recovery from having been in a spiritually abusive church prior, just like we have been, we have had to be more aware to what does it look like to counsel, to pastor those who have been in spiritually abusive situations. And I did not realize that I had been in a spiritually abusive context, faith community, prior to Fuller, until I was sitting in a pastoral care and abuse class, and Dr. Del Ryan, whom I love dearly, was talking about spiritual abuse. And of course, we're like having to engage with our own stories first so that we can talk about pastoral care and abuse in our own faith context as leaders. And it wasn't until I sat down there that Dr. Ryan gave me language for me to be able to say, oh my goodness, I was in a spiritually abusive church prior to Fuller, and still was, because that church was supporting me through seminary. And then Dr. Ryan, of course, took it to another level and says spiritual abuse operates as an ancestral system. And I said, that cannot possibly be true. Of course, like I'm there as a student, right? Like I know better than Dr. Ryan.
It is a provocative
statement. And he said it works as an ancestral system. And it's worse than any other individual abusive system. And I said, that can't possibly be true. But he said, the reason that is worse and that it works as an ancestral system is because it fosters all the other types of abuse: physical, domestic, emotional, sexual, all kinds of abuses are fostered in a spiritually abusive church.
And do you think that's because spiritual carries a certain level of authority that can like blanket everything in, and it's hard to remove yourself from?
There's frameworks that are implicit and unethical in how spiritual abuse operates. And so the abuse of power fosters
and allows
sexual,
for,
And we're willing to go along with it because
that's right.
it's
And
under
so
the veil.
misogynism
sure.
and sexism and racism at their worst,
Yeah.
distorted, domestic abuse, like all of those other abuses have this bed called spiritual abuse. And so even in a faith community, that can be covered up. And so like it's like, oh, so if sexual abuse happens in a church, oh, you just have to forgive your abuser and still go to church with them, right? Or you have a pastor, like we know, renowned pastors in our evangelical community in the U.S., encouraging that abused women stay with their abuser, who's their husband, because they shroud that trauma with theological language that perpetuates abuse. And so it was in that class where I said, oh my goodness, if I don't heal myself, meaning if I don't heal from spiritual abuse, I might end up perpetuating a system that hurt me. And I might implicitly not have trauma-informed theology to care for others as a pastor in my counseling. So spiritual abuse became this larger thing that could foster all kinds of abuses. And I was terrified, and I found the urgency to let that class inform our church and our leadership.
And Ines, sorry, can you step back one half step? How would you define spiritual abuse? Students will be learning about this in the quarter, but what did you recognize from your studies that then you applied to your situation? And feel free to be as vulnerable as not, but like what abuses did you see that you're like, this was spiritual abuse in my church?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a church operates as a family system, and all families are dysfunctional. And so when I superimposed like psychology theory from that class to a church, I was able to see who were the players and who were the abusers and who were the saviors and who were the peacekeepers, not peacemakers. And so that just as a system, a church works as a family system, and it's dysfunctional. Then on top of that, you have flawed theology, less than faithful theologies about our bodies, about how less than faithful theologies of women, less than faithful theologies on a bunch of things. So you superimpose that, and it breeds abuse of power and abuse of bodies, mental, emotional, spiritual. And you also over spiritualize trauma and say, oh, you just need to pray it away, or you're fine now that you know Jesus. You know, we don't care about our bodies, and so then we suppress a lot of hurt. And so we have walking around self-absorbed, narcissistic, wounded leaders leading churches that perpetuate abuse and train their leaders to perpetuate abuse. And so it's less than faithful theologies plus a really terrible family system as a church together breeds awful faith communities. And I'm not afraid to say, all you have to go look at is go listen to the Mars Hill podcast. That is a horrendous example and case study of a spiritual abusive situation. And so in that class, I remember thinking, I don't want to perpetuate that. I don't ever want to be the one, because just because you have a woman at the head of a church doesn't mean you don't have the ability to abuse power, especially when you're working with less than faithful theology. So in our unlearning, Bobby and I as leaders, both in our personal stories separate, but also in our spiritual abuse prior to, because we went to the same church and had, different but also similar experience of spiritual abuse, I had to say that was not okay when that leader talked to me like that, when I was demeaned like that, when I was dehumanized. That was not okay. And it took a long time for me to say I was even being complicit in my own oppression, and I got to leave. I can leave. And any person that is in a spiritual abusive situation, I no longer tell people that they should stay. No longer. See, that's unlearning and relearning theology. Also, just stay and hope for the better.
Maybe you can change the system.
Maybe you can change, but at a cost to who?
Well,
at a cost to me, at a cost to him, at a cost to our families, and our families experience that together in horrendous ways. And so we wanted to, even after we left that church, we decided to heal first for about a year before we planted a church. Otherwise, we would have just messed people up. We would have wounded other people if we had just quickly gone from one thing to the next.
Almost like a savior complex. Like, let's just go ahead and like reverse everything that we've seen.
Or reactionary to like, well, that's not how church should be, so we have the answer. A savior complex of we have the best church. Like,
which then kind of could perpetuate the kind of thing you're talking about. And with the Mars Hill, I love that you brought up that podcast. There's, as I understood it, there were so few levels of accountability to hold any of the leaders to anything.
One solo leader.
So everybody, a lot of people were feeling these things and feeling abused in the system, but they had no way to voice it. And so, then it just sort of blew up there at the end.
Our church name, The Church We Hope For, was not named in some sort of lofty, idealistic, we're better than anyone else. This is the church we hope for compared to your church kind of way. It actually was birthed in brokenness. It was birthed in a place where the two of us could not imagine what would it look like for us to lead something together in freedom, in equity, in shalom. And so this was just, God, we hope for a church that we can live into like that. Not in comparison to anything else or anywhere else, but it was birthed in a place where we were feeling such pain from hurt and from trauma that we just said, God, we hope, could you do a church like that? So it wasn't even supposed to be the name of the church. It was supposed to be a placeholder for the church we were hoping for. So we put this as like our social media account of, hey, we're going to start doing this thing. Come on board if you want to join us. We said even in the early, like the second post ever, this is not the name of the church. This is just...
It ends in a preposition.
It's about...
And it really bothers
the church we're hoping for.
It's true.
But because of such, I think, symmetrical stories with so many people that have been hurt along the way, when they saw that hope integrated with church, that those two could be connected again. The we, who is the we? An invitational, broad we. There was something that began to stick, and at some point we just said, like, oh man, I think we accidentally named the church we hope for.
Our placeholder became the
now it's stuck.
I love that.
Yeah,
that's
but
great.
I mean, I think hope, we sometimes give it too much of a lighter, flimsy kind of thing. But for us, our hope came from a place of pain. We really longed. It could have been the church we longed for. I feel like we know that word a little bit better. But it's because we were denied it in other spaces.
Thank you. I love that. I didn't know that about the name of your church.
Yeah.
That's fun to know now.
She still wonders, well, God, you could rename it.
Without the preposition at the end.
Without a preposition.
So when someone comes to you, say Pastor Ines, and says, I have been sexually abused in my past, male or female, and they start to tell you the story, they're not going to stop and say, is this okay for you? They're probably just going to launch into the story, right? And you're going to welcome that. What do you do? How do you handle that?
I of course, I listen empathically, and I will ask if this is the first time they're telling their story to a faith leader, and if they've gone to therapy before, to address it. If they have not gone to therapy before, I will refer them to therapy, because I am not a trained therapist, and I think we've gotten in trouble there before as pastors, just in general, thinking that we can just pray something away. And say, well, that happened, forget about it, and we're new creation in Christ, we're moving forward, right? So I believe in the integration of psychology and spiritual direction, and I know my boundaries as a pastor and the things I'm trained for and not trained for. So even though I took a pastoral care and abuse class and a spiritual formation class through the 12-step program at Fuller, that doesn't qualify me to be a therapist, and so I know my boundaries. If they're not in therapy, I will recommend that they go to therapy. And I'm just another voice in the conversation, to be a spiritual director, to be a spiritual listener as a pastor. If they don't go to therapy, I don't keep meeting with them.
Really? And how do you voice that frame for them?
Well, when I was a chaplain at Fuller, I could just, say, I'm not going to meet with you again.
My boss told me to.
But, people who have experienced sexual abuse have a hard time trusting, and so I know it's not like 1, 2, 3. If you don't go to therapy, I'll cut you off.
Right.
I patiently wait and walk alongside, and I Actually, I don't remember right now a person who hasn't gone to therapy after I recommended. I think it's because we're listeners, empathic listeners. We're developing trust, and that's slow work, you know. But everyone that I have recommended to go to therapy is going, and kicking and screaming, but they're going. And I also try to model it and say I have gone to therapy before in different seasons. I meet with a spiritual director.
And how was that? How was therapy when you went?
Were you the kicking and screaming?
So I was kicking
There's
and
a
screaming.
story here.
And Bobby said, you should go to therapy.
So one of the real great shows, I mean, my first class at Fuller was Scott Cormode, Vocation Formation. And on that first day of class, I remember him saying, in the most formative part of my experience as a young student at Fuller many years ago, was that the psychology school gave free therapy sessions to students for 10 weeks or whatever that is. So this is my first week at Fuller. I had just moved my family dramatically across the country from Arkansas. We're all family, all grandparents, all friends. We've now gone on our own exilic journey to California where we don't know a soul. Everybody's crying. We really feel like this is what God's inviting us into. But I recognize this is going to be a hard, long road. And so Scott Cormode said, I advocate for you guys to go over to this. So I did. I left the room after the class was over. I walked straight to the School of Psychology, and they were like, this is the first week. We're not ready for students yet. We'll get there. We'll put you on a list. I was like, but I'm ready.
But
I'm
I need it
signed
now.
up.
Dr. Kumon
Scott
said.
He said the most, I mean, he said it was the most formative. Like, that's powerful. That this, I'm in a theology degree, and he's telling me the most formative thing for him was to walk over to the School of Psychology. So I had a lot of learning and unlearning to do there to sit with that. And I did. I went through 3 sessions. Every year I would go through another session of therapy. And so when Ines was a new student and I saw the same cloudiness in her eyes,
What did I do?
I said, well, you might want to go to the therapist. It's free. I'll walk you over there.
Right.
So I'll tell the story because I'll tell it true.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. You get to go now. You get the last.
Thank
you.
you. They'll get the
There.
last
I felt
word.
like
The last
I was.
word.
It's not patronizing. I felt like, because this is how your body felt. I felt like I was dropping off the kindergartner for the first day of school with her lunch
I was
pail.
so scared.
Her shoulders are slumped.
So
She like
scared.
slinks off. She's looking back at me. I think she wants to cuss at me. It's like one of those like
I think
things.
I did. I don't know if you want to.
And I waited the whole hour until she came back
absolutely
out,
did.
and she came out. And she was like, "This was just crap." She said, "I talked for an hour.
No. You said.
They didn't give me."
What did you think? I said I hated it, and he said
Good.
good.
I can see that.
She's like, "They didn't give me any advice. They didn't give me any things to do to fix. There was no plan. I kept trying to have a conversation. They were just listening the whole time."
I was talking.
She was like, "I was just talking. I didn't do anything."
That's so honest. It's so true.
But I think as you worked your way through it, I think
Yeah.
you found what was sacred in that space that was yours, and that was probably scary. I think therapy for me is scary because every time I drive in there, I realize this is about me, and I'm much better with it being about you.
Yeah.
I can sit here and listen to you all day.
But, not Ines, but just
right, just
general
you,
anyway.
know, or you too.
For sure.
But to be confronted with what am I going to talk about? I don't know. What am I going to confront? What am I going to name? What am I going to find about myself? It's scary work.
Yeah. And 10 weeks for free, I went for 13 because I'm an overachiever. That's how much therapy I needed. They were like, we can give you a few more weeks for free. Right?
Keep her in.
She needs to stay. And I had already been through therapy, like significant crisis in my life in my 20s. And I didn't expect to have to look within again, to look within. And there were things that were popping up, not just only theology, but my body was feeling things. So at the time, you know, I can say this, Bobby wouldn't say this, but at the time I was not Sabbathing. It was my first quarter at Fuller, 10 weeks, and halfway through, I had lost 20 pounds from stress, from the work. And so when you're feeling fractured and fragmented, you don't feel right up here. And and then things start rising up from your past, and so you go back into self-protective mechanisms or parts of your story that you don't even realize. I was just a walking zombie, trying to be a mom, wife, student, trying to read everything that I was being given.
Of course you did.
And it was just like the little crack that I needed in my soul for Bobby to say, you need to go to therapy. And I remember getting up, not wanting to get up on Thanksgiving Day, like didn't have the energy to get up. I was fatigued, mentally unhealthy.
Knew you were going to be around people,
and I know I was going to be around people.
Even
I mean,
people
I could
you
start
love and
crying now.
trust,
I was like, I don't think I can even go to Bobby and Amy's for Thanksgiving lunch today. I just was paralyzed, and it was very vulnerable for my brother, my friend here, whom I love, to come and say, "You don't look good. Like you lost so much weight so fast, not from exercise, but from stress." That there's something else going on. So as faith leaders, it's the responsibility of a faith leader to define reality and to do so with compassion and to say, what's the thing below the thing? This isn't about the weight that you've lost. This isn't about not just wanting to not get out of bed. And so Bobby was like, I will help you make that appointment, or you can make it, or I'll help you make it. And then he walked me to the appointment, or met me there, I think just to be sure that I wouldn't run away and then that I wouldn't leave early. And to sit down, we need that listening presence. And so when I was a chaplain working under you for a couple of years, it gave me great joy just to be like, I just have to sit here and be a listening presence to people that are going to go through the trauma of seminary, and it just makes some things rise up. And so as faith leaders, like Dr. Scott Promote attested, it'll be the most formative thing for us to be shaped. We're being trained to ask the text a lot of questions, right? But do we ever let the text ask questions of us, or others ask questions of us? And so that's being aware and attentive to our bodily theology as well, and to our mind, and to, it's taboo in general. Mental health is taboo in general, not just in the Latino community, but white community, black community, any community, really. Just the integration of our psyche with spirituality has been like, oh, you don't need that. You don't, My father never went to. Why are you going to go to a psychologist to talk to people that you don't know? And so I never went to see a counselor for my childhood traumas until my 20s and 30s. And so that too is what we're faced with when somebody comes and says, I've been sexually abused. They may have come from a context that going to a therapist was taboo and was downplayed or made fun of, and how can we lead if we not lead from a place of ourselves going to therapy? And so we know our boundaries, I think, but we also come at it from our own experience with trauma, some of the training that we receive, but also know that we need a collection of voices around us as pastors. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I'm loving this wisdom. I just was thinking how appreciative I am that you both shared your stories of going to therapy. I am also in therapy, and it does have a stigma attached to it that can be really hard to get past. And yet, I mean, I think what we've been talking about this whole time is we all have trauma in our bodies in some way or another. We all have fractured brokenness, and what better time to try and heal than in a seminary space where you're already getting deconstructed in lots of different ways, right? So there's your theologies, your kind of the ways that your culture, your race, your gender has caused you to see things in particular ways. Like, it seems like a natural time, a good time, and a painful time to go to a therapist or spiritual director and just start saying, why am I doing some of the things that I do? Why does this come up? Or why am I so stressed right now? Trying to carry so many things. So I guess that's just a thank you and an appreciation that we can even laugh about therapy, that it can be funky and hard and weird. I mean, I'm
mostly hard.
I'm a therapist, and I get it. Like, it's hard. It's hard work for people to do, and I think it's a very brave thing to do. So,
and I think it dignifies the imago Dei within us in a way that I don't hear talked about often. Therapy is this internal work, right? I mean, there can be a combination of medication, which we are all in support of as well, when necessary. So even to remove the stigma of medication, having conversations with parishioners about depression medication or anxiety medication they may be on, I've never talked with a pastor about this before, because there is this like,
Yeah.
we're not supposed to say
Mhm.
that. We're not supposed to talk about depression in the church or medication or whatever that might be. But the other essence is different. We're not going to a gym to lift weights where we find the strength with some other external mechanism. The healing is in us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's somebody listening in tune with our life
Yeah.
and with what God's doing. And to think that there's something in what God has created in here
Mm-hmm.
that if I continue to sit with and be patient with and loving with and attentive to it, like there's healing in here already
Yeah.
that I can find and discover more along the way. And so I think therapy in and of itself can help us realize like, oh, there's goodness in us that I can continue to unpack along the way too.
It's really good. I love that. Thank you. I want to switch just a little bit to talk about, so we've thought about this idea of embedded cognition. So we can't be who we're called to be without being in relation to others. So we extend ourselves to others, others extend themselves to us, and that's how we become more and more human. So we think about that in terms of the church. I think I shared the quote with you guys that I shared with the class. It's in Dr. Strawn and Dr. Brown's book. We can't become a Christian alone, right? It's a provocative statement too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in that our faith can be personal, but not private. That's not biblical.
Yeah.
There's something in the extension of ourselves that's important. So there's that concept. Bam, hit COVID. Shut most of the churches down in some ways or another, including your story that you were launching a church when COVID came. That disrupts that the ability to get together and be together.
Mm-hmm.
So in all of that, I guess I'm just wondering, how have you thought about the need to get together, to be together as church? What did that look like through COVID? And we can even extend that to our students are online. And so we're a learning community, but we're learning separately. How do you think about that kind of the way we extend ourselves, our minds, our bodies with others?
We started the church online, not in grand design or plan, but out of necessity, having to pivot. We were already in the process of starting, and then COVID hit. And so rather than just sitting with this idea of a church, we just opened up our laptops. And when we opened them up on a Sunday morning and invited other people to come, they came. And we were both very surprised. We're texting each other during the service, like, they're here. What's happening? Is this a church? What are we doing?
Wait,
how long is this going?
Because
we were just surprised that people were willing to be a part of this thing. You don't know. You've been carrying like
an established church.
Carrying this precious newborn that you care about, but to see other people caring about it with you is a great surprise. And we're never not surprised when new people come and check that out, care about the things that we care about. So I think we started in that way as a pivot. And I think what we realized is the technology gave us a tool for the possibility of connectivity. It at least allowed the possibility of connectivity to still happen. And I think we maximized that tool to the full extent.
Yes,
I think Zoom with our faces, I heard somewhere along the way that closeness you see when we're on a Zoom screen with each other, our bodies associate that closeness either with intimacy or with fear. And because we don't ever get that close to somebody's face,
right, like
in natural relation, but like I see all of the face.
You see every inch.
And so there's something happening with our
wrinkle.
bodies that we have to pay attention to with Zoom, even in that.
Yeah.
We're also in somebody's home, which again is related to like a level of intimacy to be inside someone's home.
That's right.
So those gave us some intimacy, and then the Zoom chat for us became a place where we invited people to be in conversation with us in real time. And so as people were sharing their testimonials, and that's become like a huge principle for us at the church. If you're part of this church, we want to hear your story. What's God doing in your life? What has God been doing in your life? Where are you hurting and suffering? And we can hold that with you. As people began to share, as we began to preach, we would leave the chat open. And you're preaching this like brilliant point in your mind, and then somebody adds a sentence over here, and you're like, "Well, that's better."
You said it better than I
They
did.
said it better. I'm just going to add that into the fold, but it became this like larger, like we were organically building something together, and so that was beautiful. But I think it comes with a limit. I think there is potentially an expiration date on how connected you can get through that. I think we maximized the level of intimacy, and we're surprised by it. But when we had our first in-person gathering of some sort, we had a retreat at Mater Dolorosa in Sierra Madre.
Mhm.
We went to an art show during AAPI month last year that was focused on Asian American art related to racial injustice in our world. And when our people touched one another, embraced one another, they didn't want to leave. And that didn't happen on the Zoom screen in the same way. And so our people needed the embodied relational experience, but how they approached each other was so different than if that was the first way that they'd ever met. And so it created these relationships, connectivity, that then when those moved from online dating to in-person, there was a real spark that had already been formed, and you'd already heard somebody's story, and so you were excited to see them and connect with them. So now we're fully in person. But I think all of that starting online helped create this like real depth of intimacy and connectedness, from the mechanics of Zoom itself to the way that we interacted while we were on it.
We had the challenge that we didn't have a building just like every other church.
Sure.
But we started that way.
Right.
I mean, we had met a couple of times in house church, but then we were hit with the pandemic. And so we had to be very intentional to learn how to be bodies without a building, and how to be the body without a building, the body of Christ. And so when Bobby
Which in
says,
evangelical church, the building is everything.
the building
it's like,
is
you're
everything.
gonna own the building.
Right.
You're gonna have the
Stick
huge.
all kinds of bodies in
Yes.
there.
So even
but
that was deconstructed.
That was a
that-
deconstructing.
And you didn't
like,
plan that one.
We did
but
not
we didn't have the
plan.
money for the building
We
anyway.
did not have the money for the building. We could not plan that.
Yeah.
And so it forced us also, even as we were scrambling with other churches to go online, it still forced us to do it differently.
Yeah.
We did not want to just like, well, here's my sermon and here's the worship and just like project. So what Bobby is talking about is we use every possible way to allow that space to be participatory, so that the bodies could shape that space. And so, yes, we utilize the Zoom chat, and I still very much miss it. I very much miss, as a preacher, having people respond to my sermon, and we called it co-creating the sermon together, because people were responding, and so we were able to do theological reflection on the go. But
We
you
would
wouldn't
often
be able to
save
do
the
that.
chat. Like we would
Oh,
save
I
it
have saved chats
and go read it
from
again.
amazing
after the
theology
service.
that rose during
Yeah.
during the sermon.
Yeah.
And sometimes I would pick up something and roll with it. Bobby would do the same. Pick up a word that somebody said, and it would take our sermon in a different direction than our notes.
Somebody's sharing as we're preaching, oh, this is really tender. I just lost my grandmother this week.
Yes.
Dot, dot, dot.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a pastor, in real time, as you're preaching, as I'm preaching, and you receive that word,
Yeah.
you pivot immediately to pastoral care. And then we're watching our people care for one another in real time.
Because
Yeah.
you're modeling it and they're
And you're
doing
like,
it as
oh
well.
my gosh, this is
Yes,
church.
because
Like,
you're not
this
just
is
listening to a video. It's very participatory.
So the extension of technology can actually make it better,
Yeah.
right?
And we decentered ourselves in that way by allowing the Zoom chat to also be open, so that it was like a communal sermon, which never have I experienced that before. The most I've experienced that is call and response in the Latino church, but even then it's just an amen or hallelujah, not like whole entire words and sentences and thoughts. But also we decentered ourselves by allowing testimonials. So we didn't know each other. All these people that showed up were strangers to each other and to us, many of them. And so we allowed like 3 to 4 minute stories and testimonials as a cultural practice and as a spiritual practice, where people are telling their stories of where they are. Well, their bodies and their stories shaped our spiritual community. So this is why whenever we met for the first time at Mater Dolorosa or at the art exhibit, we were so excited to see each other, because they hadn't just been listening to us lecture or preach at them. Now the communal stories was part of us.
Or something co-created.
Yes, different backgrounds, multi-ethnic community, different kinds of stories, trauma. And so then we're like, oh, I know this person, but I've never met them. So our bodies like lean towards each other, because we're like, I care about them now. Oh, you're the mother of,
there's a
an
familiarity
autistic son,
and
and you're a fighter for your child. Oh, you're a da-da-da-da. Whatever it is, we didn't realize, by being that intentional with their bodies as well and their stories, it would shape our spiritual community, because it was a spiritual practice that over time shapes the character of our community. And so we were surprised by that.
Yeah.
We both would say we'd be surprised by that.
Yeah, and I think about,
Online.
when we talk about our faith in relation to others, and that's where our faith can grow. Like, we can't just have it on our own individual, isolated island. I think about really practical, like a black man in our church listening to a Korean American woman share about the very specific pain invisibility, fetishization or sexualization of an Asian American woman, and him to be able to say, I never knew that was, I knew my reality as a black man in this world, but I never knew your reality as and what you carried. And to be able to say, and I will carry that with you now. So an openness of like pain that was outside of our own experience and body, to then be able to share that in a safety where we can carry that with each other. So now my faith is forever impacted by this whole moment that has just taken place for experiences beyond even myself. And so my faith will never be the same because of that.
And that's the extended way that our faith grows, right? That you are impacted by this relational connection and the openness and awareness that you'll never be the same.
Never be the same. I can't be. You know, I could if I chose to do this, or I chose to close my eyes. But if I want to live with an openness in life, then yeah, I can't be the same.
Are you losing something by going back to completely in person?
Yeah, we've weighed that, and we had a lot of people ask that. Are we going to do a full hybrid or something? So I think all change is loss is something we talk about all the time. But for us, the gain of being together was worth it, and that doesn't diminish the beauty and the goodness of that online Zoom chat space. But I think we recognized our bodies need to be near one another. There is something healing that happens when I'm singing and there is a voice next to me singing, and our voices together are intermingling to make a song together. And there's a crack in your voice when you're singing because it's tender, or there's a crack in your voice because it just doesn't sound good. But I don't sound that great either. But we're singing this song together, and there's something that our bodies were made for. That's why we go to a concert in person. It's why we're excited when we go to a soccer stadium and we're all doing the chant together. Our bodies know this is doing something. We somehow disassociated that from church, though. And we think that we can just be disembodied in our faith practice. But you'll go to the concert. You'll go to the sporting event and know that the cheering is doing something with the people next to you. So
there have been psychological studies that actually talk about like choral singing, like when you're singing together in this synchronous way, that it does something psychologically and physically. It grounds you. And it's kind of a very positive benefit to be even singing together, which you wouldn't think like, well, we just sing to sing, but no, you sing, it actually brings synchronicity.
So as a church plant that started online, we've had to, because a community has a voice that they share, we've had to find our voice now of what it's like when we sing together. People didn't know, is this going to be like a happy, clap, charismatic experience? Is this going to be a frozen, chosen, contemplative experience? What's going to happen when we're all in the same room singing together? And we've had to say yes and yes.
Which is it? I want to know. Is it happy, clappy?
We're trying to create a mixture that feels more like us, kind of similar to not writing the vision statement ahead of time. We're trying to cultivate an environment that really feels true to us, and it's a little of all of it, I think.
I think because we lost. In isolation, we lost our proximity to our bodies.
Right.
And that's when I realized, I've always wondered psychologically if someone could explain to me why I need music and the voices of people, because I missed it so much during the pandemic, and I didn't realize it, how much I had mild depression during the pandemic, or anxiety, and how much I needed to be in a room with other bodies, and I needed like the music to like bounce off of me, like I needed the drums and I didn't realize that I needed it for my own mental health or for my soul. I love singing, and I'm very embodied and expressive when I sing.
I'll find you that
worship.
Article.
But I will, And so I think because we don't have access to that, because we're still living in this trauma of still kind of in a hybrid because of COVID, we're returning and having to learn, what do our bodies do now?
What does my voice sound
like?
What
does my voice sound like?
Because we haven't done that in so long.
How do we do this together? And to realize we need it, and we need movement. We need to move, and that I need other voices as well. So there are some things that I missed from the online space, but my body needs the socialization as much as for my spirituality.
And our Easter Sunday service Sunday service was powerful for Easter, but we had a potluck afterward, and we were the last two to show up because we were still locking up the church space and all that. And we show up, and it's in a backyard, not different than this,
Mhm.
and it was in full swing, and people were in conversations and laughter and dancing.
Dancing.
Um,
dancing salsa afterwards.
But we realized this is church.
Yeah.
Like this.
And it was
We had
spiritual.
a pastor who's planted the church
That's
before us
beautiful.
turn to us and say,
Mhm.
y'all don't miss this. Look at your people. Look at how they're laughing together. Look at how they're sharing a
Beautiful.
table together. Look at the dancing that's happening.
Yeah.
He's like, don't miss this. This is it. This is what y'all have been working to help cultivate.
Mhm.
What was that like for you to hear that?
Well, you were dancing, so you
I
didn't
was
hear it.
dancing that part.
This is on the dance floor.
But
so.
I was very aware of
Yeah.
what the resurrection that's happening to my
Yeah.
body
Yeah.
and to all of our bodies. Like something really terrible happened to us globally. And I don't think that we, as we know from trauma theory, when trauma is happening, we don't have access to the language to describe what's happening to us. We're still learning what this pandemic did and has done to us physically. And so, but an awakening is happening. And even in my own body, like the desire to dance and to
Yeah.
like just be silly and
Mhm.
fun. And of course, that's breaking a lot of taboos historically too. Like pastors can have fun and they can dance. But especially after so much trauma this year, so much lament, we have to fight for a celebration. As much as our church is really great at lamentation, we have to really fight
Yeah.
for celebration
Yeah.
and to hold both in tension.
Yeah.
We can lament really well
Oh,
in
we're
our
great at
church.
it. Yeah.
But celebration, and so me moving my body with like other people at church, that potluck, was very liberating to me. And I think I said, I think I'm becoming resurrected from what has happened to us these past 2 years. I am being resurrected. I believe it that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, but I'm still believing and learning to believe that I'm being resurrected, and I think everyone else around me is too. And then, who do we become together after resurrection? Then, if we're being resurrected, it's an ongoing, evolving.
There's a little bit of an out of body experience for me for a while because I was so filled with gratitude. I was just like floating, appreciating everything that was happening,
And
I felt
recording me while I was
didn't-
dancing. So rude.
I didn't even know how to like
You love
enter
it.
into it. But yeah, I think the thing that I remember most about the night was sitting by the fire with a few friends and just having really slow conversations. And I was like, this is it. This is what we've been fighting for. Yeah.
Resurrection. That's good. So good. Well, I just have a couple other questions. I love this conversation. I love it. So thank you. To whom do you refer when you have things that come up and you need help? You've mentioned therapists, but more specifically, who do you think about that you go to for help outside of your own ministry work?
I remember thinking that the Thrive Center at I'm not sure if it's connected to Fuller or if it's like it is connected to Fuller, but they have such great resources that seem to be accessible. Also, just for me as a non-trained therapist, not a therapist. What I mean. And so I think about the Thrive Center a lot because I go there often, especially with the work of grief and the stages of grief. And that has been a place where I go to keep learning, as well as the School of Psychology at Fuller is where I have referred people before, and I'm sure there's more.
Yeah, I'd say one of our greatest strengths as leaders is we know what we don't know as best as we can, and we know that we cannot fix everything. If I have a carpentry question, I know to call a carpenter, or if I have a question about the plumbing, I know to call a plumber. And so this is definitely one of our limits, but we are in close relationship with some great therapists that we are friends with, like real relational friends with. And so there have been Mondays where my poor therapist's friend that is a therapist is getting a call from me going, I had a conversation yesterday with somebody in between service, and what do you think about this? And to be able to dialogue about that in real time with somebody whose expertise I trust far beyond my own. So just leaning into those relational connections with people who have done the work in ways that we have not.
If I had money and budget, I would love to have a therapist on staff at a church. I think it's critical. I've said that for years because we need a trauma-informed church.
Really good. I have one more question, and I want to make sure I get it right because I wrote it down. Oh no, I lost it.
It's this one, I think.
Share with me my question. There we go.
She came prepared.
She did.
Prepared.
It's printed out and it's ready to go. What are some of your biggest psychological questions that you wish you had answers to?
As you can see, I have no answers.
Yeah, there's no answers.
Do you have any thoughts?
There's blank.
It's a great question.
I'll start
I
us
have to
off.
think about
You
it.
fill in the blanks.
Go ahead.
I'm convinced, so I'll start with theology. I'm convinced people's biggest theological questions or questions of the church are related to a relationship and a person and an experience in a moment. People aren't mad at the church. They're mad at a pastor who hurt them. They're mad at an elder who hurt them. They're mad at this woman who looked at them in a certain way and questioned what they were wearing. In the same way with our theology, it all comes back to, well, you're saying something about my body that it doesn't feel true. And so our questions of theology or ecclesiology of the church come back down to real relationship. And I would say the same in my experience with psychology, that it's not an abstract frustration or uncertainty that we might have, but it's something that we could actually probably point our biggest psychological question to a pain in our life along the way. My dad battled with depression and alcoholism for all of his adulthood, and those two things came together as a 49-year-old man, and he took his own life. I was 18 years old at the time, and so huge, major psychological questions for me is, why was there not a cure for my dad's alcoholism and depression that stuck, that allowed him to find healing? And when my dad died in such a traumatic way in suicide, always for me has felt like a math problem where the numbers don't add up to what the solution came out to be. It just always feels unresolved. It feels like this math problem of, how did this and this lead to this? It just never makes sense in your mind. You can never resolve it. You can release it or find healing in it. You can never resolve it. And then a week after my dad died, my little sister was 13. She turned towards hard drugs a week afterwards. She was 13, and we didn't know for years that that's where it was birthed. But she began to develop a dependency towards drugs and opiates, a long addiction that she held well into young adulthood for her. And then in 2020, she overdosed on fentanyl. That dates all the way back to starting because her dad, my dad, took his own life related to depression and alcoholism. So why didn't my sister find healing when we're at the funeral and her friends who were addicts can come to the funeral? And some of them, it almost feels like they were flippantly healed. Like it just feels like, oh, it just went away. I'm all better. And my sister went through every possible rehabilitation in the books and could never overcome it. And so my psychological question is, why couldn't she find healing in her mind, in that addiction, in the way that it affected her body, in her relationships? Why couldn't my dad find healing? Those are my biggest, like, shake your fist at God psychological questions, but they're rooted in pain and trauma and hurt and loss. The other stuff, I mean, I'll talk about it with you in a way that's like, oh, that's an intriguing conversation. It may be an intriguing conversation for me, but your question is likely rooted to your pain somewhere in there along the way. So I think that's where I land.
Thank you for sharing that, Bobby. Yes, as we carry the pain of our own stories and our own woundedness, I don't know that I have one big psychological question, except that it is hard to navigate and integrate all the psychology of our traumas and our wounding in our own personal stories, but also as leaders who are dealing with other wounded humans as well, especially in a community that has experienced a lot of woundedness and different sources of woundedness and trauma. It's hard for us to walk in our own bodies, knowing that sometimes unintentionally we may trigger somebody. Because they're still working on their story, right? Like God is still working on them. And so to like separate, I have to sometimes separate myself and not take something personally as we unintentionally trigger each other, and have to constantly think back to, okay, I'm in charge of my triggers. I may not have been in charge of my trauma and things that happened to me, and that someone else has sinned against me, or pain or disease, or your story as well. But I am in charge of how I respond to somebody else that makes me feel, again, like my childish, 11-year-old self, or 14-year-old, or 23-year-old. And so I wish there was, I like the way you said it, like it's a mathematical thing. I wish it was something like this that we could just do and say, Jesus, please heal this. But spirituality is not that easy.
No,
It's the range of our human experience is not. It's not that easy. It's very complicated. And I think the church historically has not known how to deal with the complexity of trauma,
That's right.
and so has not known how to deal with trauma and wounds and within a faith community. So I'm still walking around desiring not to wound people, but knowing that I probably will, and I'm still walking around being triggered, but not wanting to live in that constant reactionary, but have an active response and own my own things that I have to own. That requires just a lot of mental gymnastics and spiritual gymnastics as well. And I wish it was an easy answer. But every person comes to us, and I am broken too, right?
I would say to your credit and to the credit of the culture of the church that we've cultivated is we've created space for the I don't knows. And I think that has been a cup of water even more than sometimes the answer is. Sometimes I've given somebody the answer that they're looking for, and you realize, oh, that really wasn't it. Tell me about your relationship with your dad. And you realize, like, that's the story. That's what we're really talking about. Or tell me about what that church did when you were 13 and you went and shared something true about yourself that no one else knew at that time. That's what we're really talking about. And so having space for all of that.
I know it's a very much used metaphor at Fuller, but the wounded healer, Henry Nouwen's concept that we are all wounded, and yet our wounds sometimes give us the ability to bring and creates places of healing for others. And so I just thinking through that as you guys are talking, that there's a way you've extended your woundedness into a place of healing. And sometimes getting triggered is the very thing that could bring us to a place of healing. Not always, and that's what's hard. Right? But I would imagine as pastors, people get triggered by you. Therapists,
just our role.
And the same with therapists, spiritual directors. That people, it's a projection that happens, and it actually could bring about some healing. So, but it's complex. Well, I think we could probably do this all day, but for the sake of everyone watching, perhaps we should wrap up soon. I just wanted to, as you review everything that we've talked about, is there anything more that you'd want to add? Anything you want to make sure you've said, or just, any kind of last pieces there? And then we can end it. We've got a book going on here. Okay.
Yeah, you sent me these questions earlier, and we've been talking in the stories of the resurrection appearances, where Jesus appears in real relationship with real people in real time. And I think that's just something that has shaped our theology, our practice of faith, our relationships. And so Willie Jennings' commentary on Acts, as he's first talking about Jesus reappearing over and over to people, he's talking about these moments are not just proofs that he's alive. They're not just like theological checkpoints, like, look, I'm alive. But these are real relational interactions with real people in real time. The friends who held Jesus before his anguish and their anguish, before his abandonment and their guilt, who wish to see him with their eyes one more time, hold him once more, maybe even now to say, I'm sorry. Maybe now to hold him again, to see him again, to hear him again. What Willie Jennings is doing is allowing this to become a real relational interaction that is rooted in bodies and time and space. He said this moment is more than Jesus just proofing that he's alive. It's forgiveness, it's reconciliation, it's peace. The body of Jesus is not simply evidence, it is much more. Love bound in bodies can now continue through death. Touch can be eternal. Jesus presents to his disciples a way through the fear of death by simply touching him, and it will be the way of his disciples. Disciples must touch and be touched. And then he closes with a question that just feels